Hello class, and welcome to lecture number 6 in Dr. Lewis's course on Western Civilization 1500 to the present. The topic for our lecture today will be Marxism and the birth of European socialism. In the American political experience, we often think of Karl Marx and socialism as something foreign and abstract, which in many ways it is for the American experience. But in order to understand European history, we need to know something about this influential 19th century German philosopher, about his work, and about the influence that he and his companion, Friedrich Engels, had upon the world of European politics. The questions we'll be going after today are: number 1, how did Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels come to be associates? Number 2, what did Marx believe would trigger future revolutions in Europe, particularly after learning from the lessons of the revolutions of 1848? Number 3, what problems did socialists commonly identify with capitalism? And number 4, how do the ideas of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels impact the world around them? Before we talk about the life of Karl Marx and the legacy of some of his ideas, we need to define two major, not political ideologies, but economic philosophies on how the modern world has attempted to deal with the phenomenon of the Industrial Revolution. Here talking specifically about capitalism and socialism. If we look at a textbook definition of these two different types of industrial systems, we can see some of the things that they have in common and some of the things they're very different on. If we define capitalism here, broadly it's accepted that capitalism stands for, quote, an economic system in which the means of production, here we're talking about factories in the industrial system, and distribution, here we're talking about shops, commercial places, are privately owned and financed through investments with the implicit/explicit goal of maximizing profit. Essentially, under capitalism, the way you build a factory or the way you build a shopping center is you create a corporation and you convince people to invest in you. Now, the reason why a person invests in your corporation, your factory, your shopping center, they'll invest $1, not hoping that they'll get $1.05 back, but hoping, based upon market and based upon the expansion of commerce, that their $1 investment will turn into a $10 investment. For the fact that people are oftentimes driven by greed when it comes to market economics, people will take that $10 and gamble it, reinvesting that $10 in the market economy, hoping to get $50 back, and so on and so forth. Socialism looks at this system and looks at some of the benefits of it, but also has some serious criticisms that try and change around why the system exists and how it's financed. If we talk about socialism here, I've defined it as, quote, an economic system in which the means of production and distribution are publicly owned. What we're talking about here is factories and shopping centers being owned by government, and financed through state investments with the implicit or explicit goal of wealth redistribution. What we're talking about here is, instead of having private investors, what we're talking about here are governments owning factories, opening shopping centers, being the ones in charge of producing goods, distributing goods, and creating jobs in a society, with the goal that the wealth that's produced by these different factories will then be reinvested into social programs such as healthcare, education, roads, essentially taking the ideas of production with the Industrial Revolution and creating a very different phenomenon when it comes to industrialization. Our philosopher Karl Marx critiqued many things about capitalism, but really didn't lay out what a socialist system would entail exactly. One of the most famous quotes ever from Marx, when he was asked what socialism would be like, is he said, "From each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs," essentially arguing that under socialism, people would be guaranteed a job that fit their own natural abilities, their own natural training. And in turn, with this guaranteed job, they would also be guaranteed, as long as they actively produced for that society, that all of their basic needs would be taken care of. Karl Marx did not spend most of his life trying to lay out what socialism would be like, but criticized the world around him, arguing why capitalism essentially was an inherently unstable system that Marx argued would eventually destroy itself. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were born just after the close of the Napoleonic era in the territory that we now know in modern times as Germany. What these two young men had in common is that if they had not gotten involved in political activism and social critiques, they could have lived lives of great privilege and prestige. Both young men came from quite wealthy families, and had they not been involved in politics, they could have simply been the benefactors of these wealthy families. But instead, they decided to get involved in critiquing the world around them. Young Karl was born in the year 1818, and his father was a quite successful lawyer. Quite sadly, though, out of the 9 children in the Marx family, young Karl was the only one who survived all the way up to adulthood, which tells you something about infant mortality rates at this time and the suffering of many people, even if you came from an elite family. Young Karl went off to university at the ripe age of 17, studying law and more getting interested in philosophy. By the age of 23, he was able to complete a PhD dissertation and graduate from the University of Vienna with his PhD in philosophy, which how somebody gets a PhD by the age of 23, I have no idea. I started in university when I was 16, and it took me till I was 28 to get my PhD. How he did this by 23 is absolutely amazing. He's a smart kid, he's a bookworm, and he hoped to spend his entire life as a university professor as an academic. But for the fact that he was so radical in so many of his views, he could not find a job as a university professor and looked instead to adapting his talents to journalism. Marx's friend and comrade, Friedrich Engels, came from a very different background. Engels wasn't a university bookworm, he wasn't a philosopher, he was the son of a wealthy industrialist from the German area of Barmen. What was unique about the Engels family was that they didn't just invest in German industry, but that the Engels family was also heavily involved in the textile industry in Manchester, England. In the year 1842, after a very brief and very poor career in the German military, Friedrich Engels was told by his father that essentially he needed to grow up, learn the family trade, and to get involved in business and commerce. So he sent Friedrich away from Germany and off to Manchester, England, to take over his father's factory in the year 1842. Witnessing the impoverishment of the Manchester working class, Friedrich Engels was horrified by the world he saw being produced by industrialism. What these two young men did eventually when they met was collaborated, giving up a life of privilege to critique the life of privilege that others had around them and to promote the idea of a life of equality and betterment for all people, regardless of social class distinction. Starting in the year 1842, Karl Marx began a journey of radical politics, journalism, and getting thrown out of country after country, eventually landing himself in the British capital of London. Initially, young Karl was involved in writing for a radical newspaper called the Rheinische Gazette, where he wrote primarily editorials depicting the misery of German farmers at the time and the low quality of life that German farmers were leading. For the fact that he came up with such radical ideas about social class, his newspaper was banned by the German government and Karl Marx was forced to flee the country. From Germany, he moved to the French capital of Paris, where he became the editor of a brand new radical newspaper called the Franco-German Annals. What the Franco-German Annals was hoping to do was bring together radicals and revolutionaries from France and Germany into a common philosophy and a common movement. While he was working here at the Franco-German Annals, he met a young German by the name of Friedrich Engels. Strangely enough, the two of them met not working at the newspaper initially, but they met at a very famous cafe in Paris where international chess players got together to play the game of chess. These two hit it off incredibly from the very first moment that they met each other. Karl Marx, realizing that he had found a friend of wealth and prestige who could finance his own bookworm abilities. What the Marx-Engels collaboration provided was Karl Marx was one of the most analytical minds of his generation and one of the greatest abilities when it came to intellect. An incredibly smart young man with a PhD who was well trained. Friedrich Engels had something different. He had direct experience of working within the new industrial system as a manager of a textile mill, but also he had the money for the two of them to work on politics, and that Engels could finance their livelihood, which Engels did for most of Marx's life, financing the Marx family. After just a few years of knowing each other, the two of them got together and wrote one of the most incredibly world-changing manifestos of all time. In February of 1848, in the European nation of Belgium, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, just as the revolutions were breaking out in Paris that same month, published a piece called the Communist Manifesto. What these two argued was that capitalism, particularly because of the investment aspects and the bust and boom cycles of capitalism, that capitalism was too unstable, and that it was historically inevitable that capitalism would fall apart. What they argued would come afterwards was that working class people, due to the fact that they were the social class who was suffering the most under industrial capitalism, would organize first within their workforce, then within their communities, then within the nations, and then throughout the world into a huge political movement to overthrow capitalism and to change the entire course of history. The reason why Marx and Engels became so well known was since they published this in the year 1848, and since 1848 was such a turbulent year in European politics, as European revolutionaries started reading this, it gave them confidence that even though they ended up losing the revolutions of 1848, the new revolutionary initiatives may occur in the future, and that they might play a prominent role in transforming European life. Outside of the Holy Bible and the Quran, the Communist Manifesto is considered by most historians to be one of the most influential documents ever on the development of human history. Reading just a few lines here from this short manifesto, we can get some ideas here of what Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were trying to argue and how they hoped to inspire European revolutionaries. The Communist Manifesto stating, quote, "Political power, properly so called, is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing another. We shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. In short, the communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians, or working class, have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite." Outside of the inspiring slogans and fancy words in the manifesto, we need to ask some basic 101 questions of what socialists argue about the world around them and what kind of world are they hoping to inspire. First and foremost, socialists argue that the true basis of all human societies is not ideas, it's not religion, it's not any of these things, that the basis of human society is materialism, that human beings need material goods to live. You need a roof over your head, you need food on the table, and that this is the real basis of the human experience in human society. Number two, socialists also argued that the Industrial Revolution, while it created a lot of misery for the brand new working class, that the promise of the Industrial Revolution was the industrium created enough productive capacity that for the first time in human existence, humans had the ability to take care of all people. Number three, they argued since industrialism under capitalism was based upon private investment, that the systems were too unstable, that entire economic systems and entire nation states could fall apart simply by a few investors getting nervous and pulling their money out, and that capitalism, due to its instability, needed to be changed, particularly the investment of things needed to be changed. What socialists argued for was that public ownership of factories was the key to the future. That currently the ruling classes of Europe used their control of the government to utilize the army and the legal system to control workers and other poor and exploited people from rising up in their own true interests. In order to prevent the ruling class from continuing the system of oppression, the working class people needed to seize political power as a basis to redefine the future of the economy. Essentially, the idea that workers should organize through political parties and through unions, take control of government either through revolution or a democratic peaceful process, use the power of the government for the fact that they would now be in control of the army and of the legal system to redefine the economy, essentially to have the government take over private industry, and that this was not something that could happen in one nation alone. The workers of all nations needed to see that they had common interests with each other, common goals, and that if they worked together in a system of international solidarity, they could build a common future with each other. After publishing the Communist Manifesto in 1848 and taking part in many of the revolutionary upheavals going on in the European continent, Karl Marx, like most political revolutionaries, fled the continent in 1849 after the successive counter-revolution and resettled in the British capital of London. While living in London, Karl Marx had a very difficult time holding down a job and spent most of his time focusing in on writing. During this time, his family lived in absolute utter poverty. Sadly enough, of the 6 children that Karl and his wife Jenny had with each other, the 3 of the 6 children died before the age of 10 from living in poverty. The only thing that kept a roof over the heads of the Marx family and kept food on the table was that Friedrich Engels essentially paid their bills. The main reason why Marx had a hard time holding down a job was that every single day Karl Marx would go to the reading room of the British Museum, pictured here in the upper right-hand corner, to sit, to read, to study, and to write his most scathing critique of capitalism, a book entitled Das Kapital. The very first step that Karl Marx did in studying and preparing for this manuscript is he read every single back issue of the internationally renowned journal called The Economist, essentially looking at how capitalists and financiers analyzed their own economic system to understand in their own language how the system worked and to understand some type of way of trying to challenge the system. Inspired by President Abraham Lincoln and the U.S. Civil War's goal of bringing an end to slavery, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and a number of other revolutionaries living in London in 1864 came together to create what was called the International Working Men's Association, essentially bringing together representatives of radical politics and working class movements from almost every nation in Western Europe. What these quote-unquote socialist revolutionaries proposed was, number 1, they proposed the creation of an 8-hour workday. Number 2, they believed the government should institute minimum wage laws. Number 3, they argued in nations where unions were illegal that workers should have a legal right to unionize. Number 4, that the right to vote should be expanded to all citizens. And the main thing that held them all together was a notion that kings and queens were exploiters of people throughout the world, that they should be overthrown, and inspired by the success of the American Revolution, the Europeans should overthrow all the kings and queens of the land and to establish republics. While most of these things have come true since the time of Karl Marx, and most of these things don't seem radical to our modern mind, in the year 1864, these are incredibly radical notions because there were no nations in the world where all of these different basic modern principles of modern society existed in the legal structure. Essentially, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were reflections of their time, coming together and bringing together others to challenge the exploitation they saw in the world developing around them. When Karl Marx died in the year 1883, an unlikely advocate of social welfare systems rose to prominence in the brand new nation of Germany, an individual by the name of Otto von Bismarck. In the year 1871, Otto von Bismarck, through a series of manufactured wars, had created a brand new nation called Germany. Prior to this, what we now know as Germany was a conglomeration of about 110 different kingdoms in Central Europe, where essentially all people had in common was that they spoke a similar language that we'd call German. What Otto von Bismarck did was utilize a series of wars and themes of nationalism to try and unite German people into a common cause and a common political structure. for the fact that Germans still didn't have that many things that held them in common that gave them a sense of national identity. In 1883, Otto von Bismarck decided that the most successful way to build a nation was to steal the program of the socialists. Even though Otto von Bismarck was perhaps one of the most conservative leaders of his time, he believed that by stealing the best ideas of the socialists, he could help to bring about a sense of German national unity, of German national pride, and number two, that he could also marginalize his opponents. What Otto von Bismarck did was he instituted a social security system where people who lived in Germany who were elderly could retire from their jobs and have the government take care of them with some type of pension. Number two, for working class people who lost their jobs, the German government started providing unemployment insurance, essentially assisting them at times of need so that they wouldn't be living on the streets or starving while they were looking for new jobs. Number three, also in the year 1883, a phenomenon we still don't have in the United States, German people were given a universal healthcare system where all people, regardless of social class and regardless of their economic ability, had access to free quality health care to take care of their families. Otto von Bismarck also expanded out access to the public education in Germany, particularly expanding out access to universities and decreasing the tuition, in many university cases actually making universities tuition free, and establishing minimum wage laws so that German workers could also make a decent wage and be active consumers. What this did was help, number one, to bring about a greater sense of German unity, but number two, helped create a sense of German pride and German superiority when it came to international politics. The main reason why Otto von Bismarck decided to institute all of these things was to try and marginalize the highly successful German Social Democratic Party that had also been founded during this era. The German Social Democratic Party believed in a new vision where democracy and socialism would be intertwined to create a new international vision of cooperation between workers of all lands. The efforts of the Social Democratic Party culminated in the creation in 1889 in the French capital of Paris of the creation of the Socialist International, also known as the Second International. What the Second International did was brought together socialists from almost every major nation, industrialized nation throughout the world, on a common program, and all of them having a common pledge to deal with the outbreak of imperialist tensions in the late 19th century, a theme that we'll be dealing with in our video after this lecture. What the socialists argued was that the market economy of the late 19th century was far too unstable, as multiple nations throughout the world continued down the path of industrialization, the increase in you had international competition for market domination, essentially industrial nations looking for other places throughout the world to control and dominate, to have places to sell their industrial products. What this led to, as we'll explore in our next video, is the phenomenon of imperialism, of essentially Europeans and Americans expanding out their power and dominance over colonies throughout the world, forcing these colonies to buy their industrial products. What socialists argued more and more is that the only way capitalism could survive during this new era of imperialism is that capitalism needed war. So different nations and different corporations become dominant powers throughout the world. Now, the question they put forward to workers throughout Europe was, number one, asking the question, who is it that fights in wars? And number two, who gains in wars? Essentially arguing that if a war broke out between France and between Germany, there would be French workers fighting against German workers, not in their own interests, but in the interests of the French ruling class and of the German ruling class. Essentially, socialists argued that there was nothing positive about war for workers in the modern imperialist world. That the only way to deal with this phenomenon was, number one, to unite all workers of the world into a similar political and economic union, with the principle that if a war ever did break out, that war would immediately be shut down by a general strike. The idea being that if French workers and German workers went on strike at the same time, that if there was a war going on, since that would bring an end to production for the war, it would also immediately bring an end to war. What socialists argued after this was after a general strike was utilized to prevent wars or to bring an end to wars, that workers should then take over the state, take over the economy, nationalize the factories of the world, and essentially lead a worldwide socialist revolution. Even though Karl Marx was dead, his spirit of struggle against exploitation was living on through Friedrich Engels and through his daughter Jenny Marx, who led the Socialist International in a growing critique of the international tensions that developed in the late 19th century and in the early 20th century led to the outbreak of World War I, which we'll explore in our 7th lecture in this series on European history.